Hi there, thanks very much for joining us today. And this is our, I think, probably our eighth expert panel, weekly panel, People Make It Work in Change Creation. Change Creation is a cohort program for 60 leaders from 40 organisations across the UK who are all working together to reshape their organisations. People Make It Work is an organisation development consultancy. We help cultural organisations change and develop. We have about 160 clients and 55 associates, many of whom are cultural leaders in their own right. And three of them are here with us today, Claire, Rob and Hazel. I'd like to ask them to introduce themselves and give me a sense of the kinds of topics that they wanted to explore in our panel today, and then I'll kind of come back to each of them and explore that in a little bit more detail. So first of all, Claire, would you introduce yourself and let us know what's been on your mind recently that you might bring to this conversation today?
Thanks, Richard. I'm Claire Antrobus. I am a coach, facilitator, trainer. I work on consultancy projects and evaluation as well, mainly around organisational change, organisational development and audience engagement in the arts and cultural sector. My background is in originally curating art galleries, working with artists, and then later running art galleries and museums. Today, what's been on my mind thinking about this conversation was about the urgency I feel to use the disruption of COVID-19 to try new things and to do new things in our organisation, so that what comes out of this horrible period of disruption is some positive stuff. It just feels like such an opportunity. I don't want to waste it, but I'm also struggling with my own energy levels and how much time to put into things, and aware other people are very busy too. So how do we balance, how do we invest in the right things to pilot and to try out? I'm also really conscious about how it's hitting all of us, but hitting some of us particularly hard, and how we look after and what we need to do as organisations, as charities, to look after the most vulnerable, and really worried about that in relation to workforce in particular. And the other area I've been thinking about was trust, and just really how important trust is at this time. Nationally, but also in terms of our organisations, what we can do to build and nurture trust.
Brilliant, thank you very much indeed, Claire. That sounds great. We'll be back in a minute. So first of all, I'll ask Rob to introduce yourself, Rob, and let us know what you've been thinking you might bring to this conversation today.
Thanks, Richard. Hi. So yeah, my name's Rob McPherson. I run a small consultancy called Impact up in Birmingham, which is allied to Substract, the web design agency. And I've been doing that for about a year, and we've been helping people with brand strategy, with tone of voice, with organizational structure. And I've been working across arts and education, interestingly, charities and one or two commercial clients, which has been a lot of fun. And my background is I was 15 years at Birmingham Hippodrome, working in marketing, fundraising, PR, box office and sales, venue hire, all sorts of stuff. And it was a great enterprise, charitable, as well as having a sort of a commercial head, and put a lot of people through the doors there, and did lots of fantastic education community work and festivals. And so, yeah, it's been an exciting year for me. I'm working with you and the team at People Make It Work. And the three things I thought I could look at today, I think that brand purpose is misunderstood, not terribly well focused on. And I think that organizations which are fit for brand purpose, if you like, can really use that to define a sort of new roadmap out of where we are. And I know a roadmap is what everyone wants right now, even Mr. Johnson. And we're all sort of like scrabbling for ideas. So I think that really being true to a revived brand purpose is a strong way of getting there. I've got some thoughts around that. The other one is how, as a management tool, I think design planning is really important, and allows for perhaps a greater deal of flexibility in planning that some arts organisations might feel, more akin to, especially as we're sort of all going to try to address a new kind of audience, I think, in the future, which is consumer / participant / digitally savvy or not. And I think that there's a lot of tensions there, a lot of opportunities, and design planning, I think, is an extremely useful tool for that. And then the third thing I was going to talk about was some of the most amazing sharing I've seen, and how people are being incredibly generous locally, nationally and internationally. And I think there's some great examples out there if people aren't already linking in to take really great advantage of.
Thank you very much, Rob. That sounds great. And finally, Hazel, would you like to introduce yourself and give us a sense of what's been on your mind recently?
What's been on my mind? Yes. So, hello, I'm Hazel. I don't actually have a badge for myself yet. I'm slightly allergic to the word consultant. So, as context is everything, I'll just say a bit about where I am and how I got here, because that very much informs what my reflections are at the moment. I'm a violinist by training and by original trade. I had initially sort of that classical portfolio career as an orchestral player, violin teacher, chamber musician. I migrated then into orchestra management, which is essentially being responsible for the performance and the welfare of large groups of highly unionized, highly talented musicians. I then, for just over 15 years, was a director of planning at the Royal Opera House, where we sort of shared responsibility for the future of the organisation, and so that's 1,000 staff, and of course the building as well. And then last year, the stars aligned in my favour, and I escaped to the glorious Dorset countryside with my husband, where I'm now gloriously independent and unmanaged, and I have a nice bundle of stuff I'm up to. I'm a governor of the Royal Northern College of Music. I chair a sector support organisation and a phenomenal network of creative people here in Dorset, and I'm running a couple of sort of organisational development projects for a couple of complex multidisciplined arts organisations. Why have I said all of that? Not because I want any kind of a gold star for a career achievement so far, but clearly I'm somebody who's very, very comfortable with change. I relish it, I seek it out. I'm physically and emotionally very able to cope with change. I can adapt quickly, but I'm very aware that not everybody is. Everybody's physical and emotional circumstances differ. Change isn't easy or even possible for everybody. And it's an important thing now to acknowledge that that's okay, to acknowledge those differences, and that it's okay for people to react differently and not welcome change. I'm also very aware that depending upon where you are in the sector, this crisis is affecting people very differently. If you're an artist, a maker, a performer, you're probably self-employed, so it's financially very unsettling. Your creative outlet has gone. You're having to adapt, learn new skills so you can make your work digitally available. If you're a manager, you probably feel very responsible for the welfare or the well-being of a number of other people, possibly hundreds of other people. That's a certain set of responsibilities and worries. If you own a building, if you run a building, where perhaps your entire business model depends on mass gatherings, that's a different thing. If you're currently emerging from higher education and thinking of entering the sector, that's very frightening. So again, I'm just very struck by those differences and recognizing that this means different things for different people, and that will also affect how we approach recovery. And I suppose thirdly, because 3 is the key, obviously, that my latest transition in life, I went through a very conscious process of reevaluating what's important for me, who's important for me, where can I be useful, where do I want to be, what do people need from me. And I think those are all very important questions that as individuals and as organisations and as a sector actually are being asked and should be asked at the moment. So that's where I am. That's what I'm reflecting on at the moment, and of course what that all means for leadership. So I'm very happy, Richard, to be probed on any of that. But what I thought I would speak about was the work we're currently doing in Dorset, this sector support organisation, and the network that we're getting up and running, and how some of those reflections and experiences of mine are influencing and informing how we're collectively approaching our recovery.
Beautiful. Thank you very much, Hazel. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about that organisation, and as you say, the ways in which that brings to life some of the challenges at the moment, some of the perspectives that you are bringing to it. So Claire, you mentioned that you wanted to think a bit about what we focus our energy on at the moment, where those opportunities might be. And then we're also going to think a bit about who's most affected, and then think a bit about trust in leadership. Let's spend sort of 10 minutes unpacking that. Yeah, it is a hard time to find energy and focus. Where do you think we should be spending time in order to draw out those opportunities?
Oh, well, I'll give you the coach's answer, which is, you've got to find your own place where you're going to spend your time. But I think the really critical thing for me is I'm constantly thinking about the change curve, which is helpfully on the People Make It Work website. I'm sure everybody's familiar with that. And I'm just really stuck seeing people in that bargaining phase of, can we make it work? Can we make museum opening happen with social distancing? How do we make the old things work in this new reality? And I'm thinking about going back to the basics. Hazel just talked about reevaluating. Rob's talked about the core of your brand. Can we think of more? I just don't want to lose time bargaining. And I'm just so keen to think about, and it's easy for me to say because I don't run an organisation at the moment, but I was just thinking, if I did, then the building feels like such a difficult place at the moment, and getting people into our buildings. And that's difficult already. It's difficult getting who we want into our buildings, difficult already. So can we reimagine some new creative ways to achieve our mission in different ways that are quicker, easier, cheaper? We can pilot. It just feels like such an opportunity to be creative right now. And I know lots of organisations are doing this. They're doing this in lockdown. They're doing it because their buildings are closed. And we saw it 15 years ago when the lottery was closing buildings because they were being redeveloped. There was this whole wave of innovation in community programming and in learning teams when I remember Camden Arts Centre was closed, and there was a fantastic programme in the community that Peter Cross did. New Art Gallery Walsall, there was really innovative practice that really changed and shaped what happened in learning because people were working in communities outside the building. And I'm just excited by that. And so practically, I think we all have to decide what we need to do, what we can do, but I think there's some really useful tools, and we can put links into these later on the website, but things like impact and effort matrix. But I think it's coming right back to your mission, and it's coming back to your brand values and saying, are there other ways? And just piloting that, trying new things, and not being afraid that we won't get it all right.
Thank you. Sounds really useful. So you also wanted to think a bit about who's most affected during this time.
Yeah, because I think I was thinking about that in wider society, and as the rules changed this week, I've been noticing how people are worried about risk and we've got conflicting needs in this situation, haven't we? And how are we going to manage those conflicting needs? And I was also talking to friends who are furloughed, who work for arts organisations. And I'm self-employed myself. I know many people who are self-employed. We've got such a lot of our workforce who are in very vulnerable employment situations, our technicians, our artists. So many people work in very economically vulnerable and precarious ways. And so I was thinking about, what can we do as organisations? Who do we need to be thinking about, and what can we do about it? And I was thinking particularly about those who are shielding or will need to continue to shield people in their household. And just, if people are losing their jobs in that position, how tricky things will be. I think we're all really shocked by the huge disparity of mortality rates with the BAME community. I think we need to be thinking about our frontline staff and staff in our organisations, if we reopen our buildings, who are going to be at higher risk than others. And also, my children are 12 and 13. They're largely getting on with stuff without me there. Quite how anybody is getting anything done if they've got primary school age children or younger still, they need a medal. You know, it is impossible. And yet talking to people in that position who are furloughed, they're worried sick that they're not being productive. And when hard decisions need to be made about who stays on and who doesn't, they're feeling really vulnerable, whatever reassurances they're getting. So I remember when you're pregnant and when you're on maternity leave, you've got extra protection under the law. And I feel like we need some sort of temporary allowance around protecting the most vulnerable more right now. And I don't know if we can do that because it's probably a legal thing and you're probably not allowed to do it, but it just feels like we need something like that. And if we can't do it for employment, we need to be doing it as leaders in our organisations, and particularly thinking about the self-employed. And I've heard so many self-employed people complaining about how they've been treated. And I think a lot of the time, I've been really, really lucky. A lot of my clients have been really considerate. They've offered to pay up front for work that hasn't been done yet. They've asked if I've got cash flow problems. They've accelerated payments. Some have offered to pay for work without knowing exactly what we're going to do yet. They've been really sensitive. And I think when people aren't, it's because they don't always understand the impact it has on you. But I think we really do need to be really careful about how we're treating what is a massive part of our workforce. And it's not just about kindness. I think that's the most important thing, but it's also about if we don't treat these people well, they're not going to be there when we need them. They'll have had to take other jobs.
That makes a lot of sense. And finally, I think you wanted to explore this thought about trust in our leadership. What does that involve for you?
Well, I think it's me getting a bit pessimistic after the lockdown rules changed and feeling that I had even less trust in our national leader than I would like to have at a time like this. I think because I was quite excited early on when I saw the sharing happening in our communities and looking out for people in my local community. And I've really seen that change in the last few days. I've seen people not looking after the most vulnerable, challenging the rules, trying to get round stuff. And I'm worried about that. And it just reminded me how important trust is in our organisational life, something that I'm often talking to people about when we're talking about organisational culture. And as I say, I think, you know, there's going to be a lot of difficult conversations that we need to have over the next 3-6 months with employees, with partners. And I think we need to be really mindful of trust and not eroding it by being transparent, honest, being vulnerable and sharing stuff we don't know all the answers to, and being really clear with people as far as we can, and listening to what people's needs are and looking after those relationships, because nobody wants to have to make anybody redundant or cut expenditure, but it makes such a difference if that is done well with care and with consideration for trust.
That makes sense. Thank you, Claire. Anna Dinnan on another of these panels a few weeks ago was talking about moving at the speed of trust. And I thought it was a really nice perspective about how to decide how fast something can be done, particularly if there's difficult conversations to have. It's like, you know, that there's a guide in that, isn't there? It feels like it's fundamental to leadership at the moment, as you say. Thank you. Rob, can we move to hearing a bit about your perspectives around fit for brand purpose?
Yeah, of course. That chimes a lot what Claire was saying about that trust aspect, and I think it is very much again at the heart of brands that you can believe in, who are now following through with all they say that matters to them. And I think that, you know, this is the moment. I heard twice in the last week, I've heard someone quoting Warren Buffett about, this is about the investor world, where he said, when the tide goes out, you can tell who's been swimming naked. It's to do with, you know, who's actually been prepared, who's been ready, and who's just been sort of winging it. And I think that, you know, knowing whether what you pointed at as your mission statement and your brand beliefs have actually come good for you now and are actually something you can tap into, and for the purposes of resilience and for clarity, is a hugely testing time, I think. And people, if they're not ready, now is a very important time to be ready. to do that. There's usually 3 points where brands are reviewed. One is obviously at startup, when you're just beginning and you want to sort of make a name for yourself and you want to be present. The next one is when there's a new opportunity in the markets that interest you, and maybe a challenger enters for the first time. And the third one is, of course, crisis, which is what we're all deeply into now. And I think that that essence of whether your brand can make you feel as resilient as you want, whether your teams understand what you mean, whether your stakeholders are properly bought into the values you say you really that matter to you, is a hugely testing time. Because more than that, I think that the really strong arts organizations with clear brands are using them not just as totems to cling to, or I don't know, spiritual guidance. It's also about action. It has to be about action. And I think that this is one of the times when the definition I prefer for brand, I didn't make this up, I've sort of seen it many times and I've filtered it and played with it, but it's along the lines of, brand is the ideas that people have in their own minds about you, made real by your actions and recognizable by your verbal and visual style. So, I've been in plenty of workshops where people have said, well, what's the difference between logo and brand? And you're going, brand is that really hardcore central aspect of your business. And the logo is just that visual style thing. I mean, I say just that is massively important, but it's just an element of everything around your beliefs and your understanding and your values. And I think that if people are looking at it right now, the most practical guidance I'd say is take your time. And there are 5 very, very distinct steps to doing this. The first is obviously discovery and diagnosis, which is when that honesty and trust comes to the fore. You choose who you speak to, take the pulse of stakeholders, talk internally and externally as widely as possible about what people think about you. Use that then to enter step 2, which is about articulation, really, really taking the time to conjure the language that matters, because the words are so important. And good articulation at this stage will be incredibly important to come back to, and crafting that. Mario Cuomo, Andrew Cuomo's father, used to say, you have to campaign in poetry and govern in prose. And this is the moment for writing poetry, about campaigning words that you can really believe and rally around. The third step then, which is really important for getting the articulation right, is the expression point, which is the moment when you start writing and crafting those briefs for designers, or start thinking about tone of voice documentation. Before, of course, then you step into step 4, which is about implementation and rollout. People rush to this, let's do the brochure, let's do the website, let's just get it done. And they turn around 6 months later and say, well, what difference did that make? If it doesn't come from a strong heart, it'll just evaporate and the impact will be lost completely. And then, of course, the 5th step, which isn't really the 5th step, it's a step that is the umbrella step, which is evaluation. How are you going to measure any of the things that you said you believe in when the crunch comes and when you start delivering?
Thank you, Rob.
Yeah.
We can always rely on you for a punchy quote. I've been scribbling those down, and I'll be quoting you and Warren. And you mentioned design thinking, design planning. There's another area that you were thinking about. Can you open that up, unpack that?
Yeah, I like this. I like this because I think it's something that if people haven't come across, they should really delve. I know that there's some people in the arts who say, well, all the commercial models don't apply to us because we're different. Mainstream charities are very different. We're not necessarily saving lives in the way that they are. I understand all that, but there is some really, really useful stuff coming out of the design world. Design thinking is something that I think if people are looking at their business plans now, this is a really, really, the language is much more akin to what we're about in our world. And I think that people will find it territory that's more fertile to explore in line with what their ambitions are. So I like it. It talks about empathy with the user, understanding practical and emotional needs of your consumer, whoever that might be. It's really taking time to define the problem before you start moving into that ideation phase of seeking solutions. And then it talks about prototyping. And I know there's a lot of pilot projects in the arts. I know there's lots of sort of, test cases and people having a go with various things before really going for it. And I think that can be guided very much by design thinking around prototyping before you get into that latter stage of taking it to market. The Design Council published a long time ago a thing called the Double Diamond, which is this whole idea of divergent thinking, emergent thinking, and convergent thinking. So you're exploring all these avenues, all these suggestions, letting people go off on intentional tangents before they get to a point where you have to put it together then and say, right, we've looked at all those ideas, let's put it down. So the sort of visualizations possible in that process, I think, are just more comfortable as management drivers for arts organizations struggling with where they might go next. I do think that there's some good examples. I'll give you another great quote if you like. Have you ever heard of the Shirky principle? This is Clay Shirky, one of the sort of godfathers of the internet. And he said, institutions will try to preserve the problems to which they are the solutions, which is just complete wisdom and has probably been applicable for 10,000 years. So we all try to do this to a greater or lesser degree, preserving the problems to which we are the solutions. And look how that played out for the music industry. HMV, EMI, all taking a massive hit over the last 10, 20 years. Gone are the days when we were all happily spending £12.99 on a CD. As soon as iTunes said you can just buy it track by track for 59p, as soon as Spotify said a tenner a month and you're away. And we've completely changed the way in which we consume this stuff. And I think that the arts need to think about this, need to sort of say, let's think about unbundling our presentation and slicing this up into different, more palatable points. And I don't know how people are going to consume it. I don't think it's going to be the same as it was before, but there are ways of looking at restructuring and responding in a creative way to new format opportunities in a digital sphere. And I think we've really got to spend some time thinking about what that might look like. There's lots of great digital examples of what that could entail. I was talking just yesterday, a couple of days ago, to Sean Foley at the Birmingham Rep, and he was talking about Play for Today on BBC Two and how these were broadcast live. So they were rehearsed with the cameras and the sets were made. This is 50 years ago. They were doing live into the living rooms and TV sets of millions of people. A completely different way of engaging and communicating drama in the real world in real time. And we pat ourselves on the back and think this is marvelous that we do it today through a screen, but it was being done 50 years ago. So maybe going back to some of those old ideas is a good idea. So there's lots of different ways, I think, in which design thinking can help you get into that sort of frame of mind.
Brilliant. And you wanted to finish, Rob, thinking a bit about the spirit of sharing.
Yeah, this has been amazing, I think. I think, it's a strange tension that we're all sort of locked down to a greater or lesser degree and closer to our families than we're most of the time than we're likely to be in the normal sort of working life. And yet at the same time, massively disconnected, yet connected at the same time globally. And I think that there's some real opportunities here, which I've been impressed by. I noted that the Ticketing Professionals Conference, which would usually have been 48 hours in Birmingham for 300 people, is now being spliced up into hour-long segments, taking 2 to 3 weeks to deliver, and it's attracting 1,000+ viewers from across the world. And in the same way that what you're doing now with all these Zoom meetings through People Make It Work is just opening up so much more rich content. And I think the sharing and the openness and the generosity is just extraordinary and something to take heart from. And it's, again, how do we keep this going? How do we keep these communications going when things change and when things come back? Locally, I'm helping out on a voluntary basis with some Culture Central work, which is that collective voice for all the regional members here, from the RSC to the REP and Warwick Arts Centre and all sorts, all gathering together. And it reminded me that we shouldn't throw away that idea about the cultural compacts. I think in terms of future growth, we should think about, and I think Hazel might be touching on how some of this is working in her area, connecting people up through education, through health, through arts is going to make a lot more sense, especially when there's less money to go around in the future. So I think it's an exciting time to think about what role you and your business could play in developing more of that connectivity on a local and regional basis.
That makes loads of sense. I think we might come back to you for some kind of closing tips around books and resources. But before then, let's hear Hazel talk a bit more. You started to talk about the sort of collective response to the crisis in Dorset, Hazel. Would you unpack that and tell us a bit more about the network and what that's looking like?
I will. Yeah. So this is really, I referenced earlier sort of a lot of my reflections around how change means different things to different people, and the importance of, at the moment, questioning and reevaluating who we are, what our role is. And I'll just talk about this extraordinary network that we are putting together in Dorset. So a few headlines. This network, we started off in January, so slightly pre-COVID. It's currently between 130, 140 members, and that's makers, performers, arts centres, festivals, arts organisations, but also, and this is critical, I think, to what I'm going to go on to say, higher education. We've got our local authorities in the room, members of our audience, people who collaborate with us, and our communities. We meet weekly by Zoom. Very much, it's a non-hierarchical. So yes, I kind of chair it. I have my arms around it. I initiated it, but it's very much a forum for young leaders as well, and for everybody to find their voice. It started off, the conversations were quite organic. It was very much about listening to each other. As I say, people finding their voice. But sort of since COVID, we've organised ourselves quite quickly to try and position ourselves to make a difference, to think about our future together. And I'll just talk about that a little bit. So we've got a theme, which is solidarity, which I think is a value that's going to become increasingly important to us as a sector as we think about our future. Do we really want it to be just survival of the fittest, or can we work together differently? We've got 4 aims, which I'll just talk you through. The first, they're equally important. They're interdependent, these 4 aims, but I'll take them in isolation. So the first is to support one another through this time. It's obvious, isn't it? Of course, but this is really about peer-to-peer support. And what we're seeing is this extraordinary exchange. I mean, Rob, you mentioned sharing, but an extraordinary exchange of ideas, of experiences, of connections. Just people very willing to give everything to somebody else to help them survive and just get out of this crisis. There's a lot of matchmaking going on, so we're pairing up people that need skilling up, so need digital skills, artists who are finding themselves having to make their work available digitally, whether they want to or not, but not feeling that they have the skills to do it. So we're taking those people and finding people who do have those skills, who can offer training. There's a hardship fund, a group of people have got together and I mean, this is happening all over the place, but have launched a hardship fund. These are fantastic things to witness, and I'm sure if you're a leader in your organization, to be able to just step back and see your teams and all of your staff working together to look out for one another is extremely rewarding to witness. So that's our first aim. The second aim is very much about getting to know one another better, learning, really learning more and understanding how one another's businesses work. Because if we don't have that, if we just base our decisions on assumptions and preconceptions, of course we'll miss opportunities to collaborate, to do things differently, to support, to cover each other's backs. So we've got a model for doing that, with different people coming in to talk about what they do in a really insightful way, and then we explore some of those themes coming out. I mean, a classic one, which I'm sure everybody's seeing at the moment, is individual freelance performers, artists, really hoping beyond hope that the bigger institutions, the organisations, the NPOs will be able to dip into their deep pockets and bail everybody out. And it took a little while for the pennies to drop when the big brothers came into the room and explained what it is to be a charity, and explained what it is to run a building and to have employees and to have audiences. And all of a sudden, any reserves you thought you had are drained, and it's not through lack of interest or care, but until you know that, it's very difficult to have that dialogue and understand what you can expect and what you can hope for. And I'm talking about a network in Dorset, but the same as if you run a big institution, a multidisciplined institution, that sort of the idea of internal engagement. And the wardrobe department understanding how the orchestra work and understanding what the legal team are doing. It's so important to be able to, you can't find new ways of working, more efficient ways of working, smarter ways of working if you really don't know each other. You don't really know each other. So it's again, a really important thing to make time for, I think. So that's the second thing, a second aim. Our third and fourth aims are kind of linked, can't decide which order they go in, so I'll kind of bundle them together. We're looking at our manifesto. So can we together create a manifesto for arts and culture in Dorset? What's our role? How do we fit? What does the ecology need from us? So remember, again, we've got higher education, we've got health, we've got our communities, our audiences, the local authorities in the room. So we're really questioning what our role is. What can we do to be of use, to be of value? What does, you've asked the question I've read, Richard, what does society want from us, need from us? And there's a real feeling in the room that, there's an acknowledgement that not everybody's going to survive. Let's be honest, this crisis is going to, it's going to look, the world will look different for a lot of people. We won't all survive, but maybe by having these conversations, working together differently, we might increase our chances of survival. So instead of fighting against each other for that decreasing pot of money, can we find different ways that would give more value for money? And then fourth, could be third, I'll call it fourth for today, is what do we want to fight for collectively? And that's at local level with our local authorities in the room, and also at national level. And this is an interesting one because, again, recognizing differences at the beginning of these conversations, that there are a lot of people, and there still are some who are, we don't want to fight. We don't fight. I'm an artist. But actually, by working together and building up these conversations together and building a picture of what we want our future to look like, people are thinking more about, well, how are we going to, we have a responsibility to go and shape our own future, not just sit back and wait for the same old model to be put in place and the same old funding model to determine whether or not we're going to have a role to play. So they're our four aims, and it's exceptionally rewarding, I have to say, to be, facilitating this and watching this happen. And we're going to be short of time today, but I think there's a lot in there that we can think about for how institutions might rebuild themselves to do things differently, perhaps even at a national level. How can we rebuild ourselves to do things differently? And it's partly for me as well, thinking about as a leader, you don't have to have all of the answers. You're surrounded by phenomenal people in your network, in your organization, in your building, and there's a huge amount of skill and passion and knowledge in there. And if you can just find a way of bringing that out and letting those conversations happen, that answers will come. I think I could pause there, Richard.
Thank you very much indeed. It sounds phenomenal. And if there are people listening to this, watching this video from Dorset, how do they connect with you? What's the name of the network that you've been talking about?
I think maybe what I'll do is I'll put a couple of links to this afterwards, if that's okay. Is that all right?
Perfect. Thank you very much. So it is about time for us to finish up. I just wondered if we might finish with some thoughts around any resources that you might recommend people want to access. I think, Rob, I think you had some suggestions.
Yes, shall I go first? Okay, I've just got three really. One I'm listening to at the moment. It's Simon Sinek's latest book. It's called The Infinite Game. It's really great, and I think again it's one of those ones where arts organisations can really get an angle. Even though he talks about commercial world, he talks about politics. It's really excellent, and there's something that resonated. I've only got to like about chapter 3 or something, listening to it, and he talks about advancing a just cause, building trusting teams, studying worthy opponents, and being prepared for existential flexibility. And I think this was published in January of this year, and it's like he just knew what was coming, and it's just an amazing read. And you can walk for miles listening to this. Well, can't walk for that many miles, but you can walk for a few miles for an hour or two, and it's fab. And the other one that is well worth looking at, it was published last week by Suzanne Moore in The Guardian. I don't know if you saw it. It was called Rewilding the Cultural Landscape. So just check that out, Suzanne Moore in The Guardian, and it's brilliant. It's all about what happened when Jarvis Cocker and Tracy Emin were on the enterprise allowance scheme when they were unemployed. There was huge problems in the 70s and 80s. It's talking about things like Pollock and Rothko using Roosevelt's New Deal money to completely do different things with public libraries, new artistic commissions. And it's a really sort of heartening story about rethinking again about the cultural value and how we can work together to build something new and fresh at a time of crisis. And the last one I just saw the other day, it was one of the best things I've seen on YouTube recently when everyone's been putting their digital stuff on. It was Broadway.com celebrating Sondheim's 90th birthday. And the song that sang out for me is brilliant, 2.5 hours worth of Sondheim. It's from Assassins, which I saw at the Donmar Warehouse years ago. And it's a story, it's a song, The Flag Goes By. There's 2 brilliant verses in there, which just made me think, this is what we're trying to do. This is what arts branding is all about. The lines are, and you think, why try? And you want to cry that the flag goes by. And you think, that's why, because of that idea, that incredible idea. When what you want to do is brag. I'm a part of that. Yeah, I know it's just a flag. Okay, but still, for a moment you say, hey, we will fix everything tomorrow. Brilliant piece of Sondheim. Just, it'll make you cry. It's fantastic. And that's arts branding in a nutshell, written by Sondheim. It's great. Just check it out.
Thank you very much, Rob. Is there anything that either of you, any final thoughts or wisdom or resources that either of you would like to?
Or songs.
Before we finish today?
Songs.
Yeah, or a song.
I won't torture you with the song, but I've got a few links because I wrote a blog to kind of clarify my thinking. I wrote a blog. I've put some links in that so I can add the link. Just some little resources, tools that have helped me in thinking, like Hazel, reevaluating for myself. A few little things I found helpful.
Great, thank you very much indeed.
Of course, I'm going to say something a little bit different. I went for a really long walk along the coast yesterday. Which I'd encourage anybody to do, walk where you are. And I just, these are really difficult times. We're all talking about challenges and how we surmount them, but I think we have to remember sometimes as well how lucky we are. Really, you know, I felt yesterday how lucky we are to have the freedom to be able to go for a walk. And I don't just mean post-lockdown, I mean in the country we live in. We can safely go for a walk in this phenomenal country. And even that we have the freedom to be able to have these kind of conversations openly. And I think we just sometimes have to just remember how lucky we are compared to so many millions of other people in the world.
Thank you, Hazel. That sounds like a brilliant moment to close this film this week. So thank you so much for making time to share your perspectives, views and some resources with us today. peoplemakeitwork.com has a whole host of videos like this, individual videos, tools and resources, and it will soon have some links from these guys on it too, to help all of us to navigate these complex times. If you enjoyed this video, then have a look at some of the other ones that are on the site, and we wish you all the very best with your endeavours. Thanks very much indeed. Bye-bye.